Hey, this is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. And I realize it's Sunday afternoon, but we are doing a live stream this evening instead of meeting at the building. We've had some issues apparently here in the state of Arkansas. And so we're still meeting. The church here is still meeting on Sunday mornings at 10:45 at the building and on Wednesday nights at 7. But the elders made a decision that we were not going to meet tonight, but I told them I would go ahead and do a live stream anyway. And so glad to have people joining. I see we've got around 21 or so already on the live stream. And what we've been doing on Sunday nights at Mammoth over the last, 3 or 4 weeks, we've turned it kind of into a questions and answers segment. My goal was to address issues that may have come up in the sermon. So over 20 plus years of preaching, I can't tell you how many times over the years somebody will come up to me after services Sunday morning or even Sunday night, and they'll say, "Hey, you said this in your sermon. What did you mean by that? Could you explain? Could you give me another passage of Scripture?" So that's what we've been using our Sunday evening services for, is to address things like that. So I'll just go ahead and say, if you have any questions or comments, you can do this. You can do like you normally do during our daily live stream. You can put them here in the comment section on Facebook. Once this live video is over, I will add it to I'll upload it to our YouTube channel, but it'll still be on our Facebook page. So this morning I preached on the one body. We're doing this series through the book of Ephesians called One, and we started last week by just examining the first few chapters of Ephesians and then getting into chapter 4 and the first 6 verses where Paul tells us that we need to have the right heart and the right head about Christianity. Well, this morning's lesson in that series was about the one body or the one church as presented in the book of Ephesians. And I didn't get any questions about that lesson. The Bible's pretty clear. The Bible's pretty clear on this subject of the one church for which Christ died. In fact, this afternoon I spent some time getting the next edition of the Fulton County Gospel newspaper ready, and my article this next edition is called False Peace. And I kind of touched on some of the things in that article that I touched on in the lesson this morning. But like I said, I didn't get any questions about it. So I did have a question given to me, I believe it was last Sunday. One of the members here at Mammoth Spring asked me about Zechariah chapter 14. So we're going to study from Zechariah chapter 14 this afternoon for a few minutes. And the specific question that was asked to me is in regard to Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 4, where it says, "And in that day he will stand, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two." So obviously you see the title here on the lower portion of our video screen, is Jesus coming back to the earth? Jesus is coming back. There's no question about that. There's so many passages that deal with that. But my question is more specific than that. Is Jesus coming back to the earth? And what does Zechariah 14 and verse 4 mean when it says that his feet are going to stand on Mount Olive? The Mount of Olives. So here's what I want to do. I want to start out in the first part of Zechariah. Zechariah is the longest of what we call the minor prophets, and it's by far the most obscure. It's the most difficult to understand. No question about that. Zechariah is very similar to the book of Revelation. A lot of similar language, a lot of similar symbols are used in both of these documents. I don't think that's insignificant either. But anyway, the background, if you were wanting to sit down and get a background, a historical context or a historical setting for the book of Zechariah, you would need to read the book of Ezra. Zechariah is a contemporary with Haggai, and they are doing their prophetic work during the days of the reconstruction of Jerusalem after the 70-year captivity in Babylon. So you read the first 6 chapters of Ezra, and you'll get a historical context for what we now read in the book of Zechariah. And he dates the book. He tells us when he wrote. You look at Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "In the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius." Well, that's going to be about 518 BC. That's the period of time that we're considering during this book. And so we have to keep that in. It's always important to know, particularly with your Old Testament prophets, what is the historical setting? What's the political climate of the day? What's the religious climate of the day? Which, frankly, for Israel is typically not very good. When you look at all the prophets, they've got issues. They had issues. So, this book, Zechariah, is very apocalyptic. What does that mean? Well, the book of Revelation is very apocalyptic. In other words, what I mean when I say that is these books use a lot of figurative language. They use a lot of signs and symbols, a lot of image. I guess one way to put it is they use fantastic imagery in some of these visions. So just for instance, beginning in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 7, and down through the rest of that chapter, Zechariah sees some pretty interesting things. He sees a red horse standing in some myrtle trees, verse 8. He's talking with an angel, or rather an angel's talking with him. We read about the angel of the Lord in verse 11. We read about these who have been walking to and fro throughout the earth. So that's what I mean when I say apocalyptic. This book is full of that type of imagery. And if you're not careful, and I'll say the same thing here that I say with the book when I teach the book of Revelation, don't get lost in the imagery. There's a point that the author's trying to make, but what happens, I think, a lot of times when we study these apocalyptic books is we try to figure out every single symbol and nail it down precisely to perhaps a certain date or a certain person even, or a certain event. And so that's what I mean when I say don't get lost in the imagery. The imagery has meaning. The signs and symbols have meaning. But Zechariah wasn't writing this for them to sit down and figure out what every sign and symbol means. The Jewish people were a lot more familiar with this type of language than we are. But if you notice here in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 12, he talks about these 70 years. Again, this is post-captivity writing, after they've returned from Babylon. So we have to keep that in mind. So, another thing we need to keep in mind throughout the book of Zechariah is Jerusalem. So I did a little reading throughout this week. 14 chapters long, the city of Jerusalem is mentioned 42 times by name. Sometimes it's referred to as Zion. I didn't even count those. Just Jerusalem is mentioned 42 times. That's an average of 3 times per chapter. That's significant. We need to know what he's talking about, to whom he's talking, and again, when he's talking. One of the main phrases in Zechariah is, in that day. It starts, the first time that's mentioned in Zechariah is chapter 2 and verse 11. And then you have to jump over to chapter 9, and I think the first time it's mentioned in chapter 9 is verse 16. And then from chapters 9 through 14, in that day is used time after time after time. That phrase is very common in the prophetic writings of your Old Testament, in that day. And depending on context, you'll know which day is being referred to. So what day are we talking about? Let's go back to Zechariah chapter 14, and we'll start reading in verse 1. It says, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming." So we're going to start reading at verse 1, but we're going to stop right there. The day of the Lord. This phrase is, again, throughout the prophetic writings. The day of the Lord is talked about in the New Testament. And again, depending upon the context, it may be a national judgment. It might be the day of Pentecost. Okay, Isaiah chapter 2, for example. It might be the second coming of Christ, 2 Peter chapter 3. So context will tell you what the day of the Lord means. So, "Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst. For I will gather all the nations, to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city." So obviously, pretty graphic language for something in regard to the day of the Lord concerning the city of Jerusalem. Verse 3, "Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations." Well, those nations of verse 3 are the nations that attack Jerusalem in verse 2. Here's the problem. We have to figure out what he's talking about. What period of time? Because, throughout her history, Jerusalem had been attacked and defeated. Again, they're just getting back from their 70 years of captivity when King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon had attacked and destroyed Jerusalem. But we also know, we're very well aware of what happened in AD 70 when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. So again, we have to keep all that stuff in mind. So verse 4, and in that day, okay, the that day of verse 4 is in the context, again, of Jerusalem having been destroyed, but then also those nations that destroyed her being judged by God. So in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. You know, if you were looking at a biblical map, the Mount of Olives is about 2 to 3/10 of a mile east of Jerusalem. It gives you an elevated view of the city. The Mount of Olives it was used quite often by Jesus in various settings. So again, this would be a familiar place with the Jewish people. Faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, and half of it toward the south. I think one of the things that helps us understand what's being talked about here is verse 5. So here's the larger question. Is Jesus coming back to the earth? I'll say this before I start this discussion. Jesus never said, once he left, that he was coming back to the earth. He did say he was coming back, but he never taught that he was coming back to the earth. And when you look at the writings of the other New Testament authors, none of them say he was coming back to the earth. They say he was coming back. He's coming back with the clouds, 1 Thessalonians 4, just like he went up into heaven with the clouds, Acts chapter 1, verses 9 through 11. But there is no scripture that says he's coming back to the earth. See, here's a thing we have to understand too. There are a lot of people, and I've heard this statistic, anywhere from 70 to 80% of churches, I'm using that term loosely, denominations in the Christian world, 70 to 80% believe that Jesus is coming back to earth to reign for 1,000 years. Some of them use this passage, and in fact, the question that was given to me was given in that, with that context. Is that what's talking about here? And I know the person who asked me doesn't believe that, but it was, please give an explanation of this. If this is talking about Jesus returning, if that's what we're dealing with, you have some problems. Number one, you have this thing that would split the Mount of Olives. Earthquake. In fact, there's an earthquake mentioned in verse 5. You have people fleeing, the first part of verse 5. When we're talking about the second coming of Jesus at the end, Paul talks about the end in 1 Corinthians 15:24. When we're talking about the return of Christ for judgment, there are no signs. Of that day and that hour knows no one, not even the angels or the Son, but the Father only. Mark chapter 13, verse 32. There are no indicators that Christ is coming back to earth. So that's number one. Number two, when you look at verse 5, it says, when the Mount of Olives splits, part to the north and part to the south, then you shall flee through my mountain valley. Here's the thing. When Jesus comes back, there's no fleeing. There's no escaping that. You cannot run away from the judgment day. Not a possibility. So that eliminates Zechariah 14 from talking about the second coming or talking about him coming to earth to establish a kingdom for 1,000 years in the city of Jerusalem. Part of understanding this as well is I think this is important too. So looking back up at Zechariah chapter 14 and verse 2, it says, I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. And that made me think about something. I'm going to mark my Bible here in Zechariah, and then I'm going to turn to Acts chapter 4. All the nations are going to be gathered together against Jerusalem. Now, I'm not saying what this passage means, that this is what Zechariah 14 is talking about, but here's one thing I do know. The church of Christ, the church of the Bible, was established in the city of Jerusalem on the first Pentecost after the resurrection of Christ. The church began that day in the city of Jerusalem. What also began not long after that was persecution against the church. And so when I was reading Zechariah 14 and preparing to answer this question, this passage came to my mind. Acts 4, beginning in verse 23. And being let go, this is Peter and John who had been arrested for preaching. But being let go, they went to their own companions and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said to them. So when they heard that, they raised their voice to God with one accord and said, Lord, you are God, who made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, who by the mouth of your servant David have said, Why do the nations rage and the people plot vain things? The kings of the earth took their stand, and the rulers were gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. Now, when you look that up, this is a prophecy from Psalm chapter 2, the first couple of verses of Psalm 2, and it was a prophecy of persecution. Again, the rulers were gathered together, the kings of the earth took their stand against the Lord and against his Christ. And it goes on to say, For truly against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together to do whatever your hand and your purpose determined before to be done. Now, Lord, look on their threats, and grant to your servants that with all boldness they may speak your word. That's persecution that was going on. You have the nations, as that language there says in Acts 4, verses 25 and 26, the nations of the world gathered together against the church. And again, I'm not saying that that's what Zechariah 14 means, but I'm just making the point that when people gather together to persecute God's people, whether it was in the Old Testament or now under the New Covenant as the church, it's pictured as the nations gathering together against the Lord and against his people. And so going back to Zechariah chapter 14, the imagery here is all of these nations have surrounded Jerusalem for battle, Zechariah 14 verse 2. But God's going to judge those nations. There are going to be signs of this. Again, that there are going to be people who flee from it. Now, I'll tell you what I personally believe Zechariah chapter 14 is talking about. I think it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Because you see the same type of language in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke chapter 21, where Jesus tells his disciples, listen, you're going to be persecuted. He tells them that. You're going to be dragged before kings and governors. Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by armies. You're going to see all this happening. And he tells them, in fact, I'm going to turn over to Luke's account. Luke chapter 21. Listen to Luke chapter 21, beginning in verse 20. And I think this plays into the meaning of Zechariah 14. Luke 21:20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, listen again to Zechariah chapter 14, verse 3, beginning. Then the Lord will go forth against and fight against those nations, and as he fights in the day of battle, and in that day he will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two, from east to west, making a very large valley. Half of the mountain shall move toward the north, half shall move toward the south. Then you shall flee through my mountain valley, and to the mountain valley, and for the mountain valley shall reach to Azal. That's the connection I see here, because again, number one, this can't be talking about the end of time, because Jesus never said he was coming back to the earth. He said he was coming back. He never said he was coming back to the earth. There are a lot of things. If Jesus is coming back to earth, then you have a lot of problems. Number one, he can't be a king because of some prophecies in Jeremiah. Number two, he can't be a priest because he's not of the tribe of Levi. And that's Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Jesus is not coming back to the earth. So that cannot be what, well, I lost my page here. That cannot be what Zechariah chapter 14 is talking about. But when you look at the language here of Jerusalem being destroyed and then God fighting against her enemies, in my opinion, and I can't be 100% dogmatic on that, but in my opinion, that's what we're dealing with here, the destruction of Jerusalem. But again, throughout chapter 14 of Zechariah, you see this phrase, in that day. Just for instance, verse 6, it shall come to pass in that day that there will be no light, the lights will diminish. It shall be one day which is known to the Lord. Again, this is prophetic language that's common in your Old Testament prophets. language that's used in the context typically of some type of national calamity or national judgment that is initiated by God. Very similar language. Then you get down to verse 8, and in that day it shall be that living waters shall flow from Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea and half of them toward the western sea. In both summer and winter it shall occur. So again, if this is literal, if Jesus is literally coming back to Jerusalem, then you're going to have a new river forming and flowing in summer and winter. I mean, there are just too many things that don't make sense if this is talking about Jesus coming back to the earth. So I think that's what we're dealing with here in Zechariah chapter 14. Again, there are so many indicators in regard to the second coming. There are no indicators of the second coming. But here you have a mountain being split. You have people running away, verse 5, things of this nature. Jesus is not coming back to the earth. He's not going to be here for 1,000 years. When he returns in judgment, he's coming with the clouds, and those who are faithful are going to meet him in the clouds, and they're going to be there with him forever. They're going to the new heavens and new earth, which is not this heaven and earth. We're going to have a new dwelling place after this life is over. I was just looking at something over here on my desk. Again, one of the things you have to remember is the type of language that we're dealing with here. Highly figurative language throughout Zechariah. Like I said in the beginning of this lesson, very similar language to the book of Revelation. And there are some other books in your Old Testament prophets primarily that deal in this type of language. Zechariah being the most notable. And so here's another thing. You keep reading through Zechariah chapter 14. And incidentally, let me do something here real quick. At least 11 times in Zechariah 14, the city of Jerusalem is mentioned. But when you get down to Zechariah 14, beginning in verse 16, it says, "It shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem," which that's what we were reading about in the first part of chapter 14, "shall go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." So again, if this is literal, if Jesus is literally coming back to the earth, and he's going to stand on the Mount of Olives, and it's going to split in half, something that's told to us here is we're going to start observing Old Testament sacrifice days again, or feast days again. Okay, the Feast of Tabernacles. And then you go down to verse 21. "Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to the Lord of hosts. Everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. In that day there shall be no longer a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts." There are too many problems in the text to say Jesus is coming back to the earth. And let me throw this is just an extra one for you. So Jesus, he's a typical Jewish man. All right, he was born of Mary. Of course, we have the miraculous virgin birth of Christ. But he was just a typical Jewish man. And he was put to death on the cross. He was resurrected, and his body was glorified. His body was changed. Philippians chapter 3, verses 20 and 21. And, the faithful Christian has that promise that his or her body will be changed, and it'll be just like Jesus' new body. If Zechariah 14 is literal, and Jesus is going to come back and stand on the Mount of Olives, that implies that he's going to be huge. He's going to be massive, standing on the mount in the sense of above the Mount of Olives. The language just doesn't permit that. It doesn't permit a literal return to the earth for Jesus. Again, not only the figurative language here of Zechariah chapter 14, but other passages that are very clear on the second coming of Christ throughout the pages of the New Testament. So, no, Jesus is not coming back to the earth. Again, you have a lot of things to deal with. If a person believes that he is, and again, most of the people who believe that Jesus is coming back to the earth believe that he's going to be here for 1,000 years in the city of Jerusalem. There are so many passages from both the Old and New Testaments that contradicts. It is not going to happen. There is no way it could happen, because you have to nullify. Okay, so think about this. Zechariah, I'm turning to Zechariah chapter 6. This just came to my mind as I was thinking about this. One of the prophecies that Zechariah makes in regard to Jesus is this, in chapter 6, beginning in verse 12. It says, "Then speak to him, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, saying, Behold, the man whose name is the branch, from his place he shall branch out, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Yes, he shall build the temple of the Lord, he shall bear the glory, and he shall sit and rule on his throne. He shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both," between his priesthood and his kingly position. Jesus is our prophet, priest, and king. Hebrews chapter 1, verses 1 through 3 tells us that. Here's the thing. If he comes back to earth, he can't be a priest. Because on the earth, in order to be a priest, you had to be from the tribe of Levi. The Hebrews author deals with that. Hebrews chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. There was a change of the law. There was a change of the priesthood. Jesus is from the tribe of Judah. He's not from the tribe of Levi. But also, again, while he's priest, he's going to be sitting and ruling on his throne. And here's the thing. Jesus is on his throne right now. He's not coming back to this earth one day to set up a kingdom and to reign. He's doing that right now. Listen to Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse... I'll begin in verse, 29 here. It says, "Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne." Listen to that. He would raise up Christ to sit on his throne, David's throne. "He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Therefore, being exalted to the right hand of God, and having received from the Father the promise of the Holy Spirit, he poured out this which you now see and hear." Jesus is reigning right now. The promise that somebody was going to be on David's throne, Peter says here in Acts 2, was in connection with the resurrection of Christ. Verse 31. Jesus started reigning when the church was established. The church is the kingdom. It's the same institution. Colossians chapter 1, verse 13 tells us that. The kingdom existed in the first century. So, again, so many verses you can look at. And again, Zechariah is it's one of those difficult books to understand. But when you pull in these other passages that we've looked at, we know he is not coming back to the earth. He's not going to stand on the Mount of Olives. He is coming back. He is not coming back to the earth, and there's a difference in those two things. So I think I answered that question. I don't have any that I can see here on the comment section. I don't have any questions or comments here. Again, if something comes to your mind, if you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to send me a private message. You can put it here in the comment section, but I think I've dealt with that question. We have to be very careful with the type of literature that we're reading in the Bible. Whether it's a historical narrative or a parable, an allegory, figurative language like Zechariah. We have to know the type of literature that we're dealing with when we study the Bible. Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up. I appreciate all of you watching here today. And again, any questions, you can send them to me. If you have somebody that like this content that does not do Facebook, I'll upload this video to our YouTube channel as soon as I'm finished here, and they can go to YouTube and they can watch this. Same content there. So I appreciate y'all being here, and the plan is I'll be back here tomorrow morning. Zechariah is on my mind. I'll be back here tomorrow morning at 11 Central to continue our study on alleged contradictions in the Bible. So thanks for being here tonight, and hope you have a good evening.